Good afternoon, students. Here is the third part of the second chapter, that is the sexual reproduction of the flowering plants. In this part, we'll cover the following topics. The first is self-pollination, second is cross-pollination, third is the advantages and disadvantages of self-pollination, third advantages and disadvantages of cross-pollination, and lastly the adaptation that favors the cross-pollination. Now, pollination, as we know that there is a transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma. So, first of all, there are the two types of the pollination: the self-pollination and second is the cross-pollination. The self-pollination. In self-pollination, there is the transfer of the pollen grains from the stamen to the stigma of the same flower, and this is again the different types. The one is autogamy. It is defined as the transfer of the pollen grains from the anther of a flower to the stigma of the same flower. The flowers are bisexual, that is, since these are transferred from the same plant, same flowers, so therefore the flowers must be a bisexual flower, that is, it should possess the both reproductive structures. For example, in a pea, wheat and rice, all the cereal crops are the self-pollinated crops. The autogamy requires synchrony of the pollen release and stigma receptivity, that is, the maturation time of the anther and stigma should be same. If anther matures, it will start releasing the pollen grains. If we say stigma, the receptivity attains the receptivity, that is, it will start releasing a sticky liquid which traps the pollen grains. So their timing should be same, that is, there must be synchrony. Now there are the certain adaptations which favor the autogamy. The chasmogamy. In the chasmogamous flowers are the similar in structure to the flowers of the other species with exposed anther and stigma. Here in this there are certain plants where the two types of flowers are there. First type are the chasmogamous flowers. They are ordinary simple flowers with the open stigma and style. That is, there is the possibility of the cross-pollination also, that the pollen grain of the other plant may also land on the stigma of these flowers. But chasmogamous flowers, in these chasmogamous flowers, the stigma and anther are very close to each other, so before there is a possibility the cross-pollination, self-pollination occurs. So such structures, their structures are very peculiar, in which there is a possibility of the autogamy is there. Cross-pollination occurs, but it may occur very rarely. For example, in the violet, that is common pansy, oxalis and camelina. So chasmogamous flowers may show the autogamy. Definitely they'll show the autogamy because there is a synchrony of the maturity of the anther and stigma is there. But there the chances of cross-pollination is there. Geitonogamy, the possibility of geitonogamy is also there. As we discussed in the case of the common pansy, there are the two types of flowers and oxalis. One are open, while in the cleistogamous flowers, these cleistogamous flowers are again bisexual flowers, but that remain closed, and pollen grains pollinate only the stigma of the same flowers. Since they do not open at all, so foreign pollen possibility the landing of the foreign pollen is very rare. So they are strictly autogamous and most effective mode of self-pollination, for in case of the Lathyrus, Oxalis and Viola. Geitonogamy is also a kind of self-pollination in which there is a transfer of the pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of the another flower of the same plant. Means pollen grains land from the same plant to the flower of the same plant, another flower of the same plant. So this is called the geitonogamy. It is not complete autogamy. The cross-pollination. Cross-pollination is a transfer of pollen grain of one plant to the flower of the another plant of the same species. Now it is known as genogamy or allogamy. So there is a transfer of pollen grain from the anther to stigma of the different plant of the same species. Merits of self-pollination: it provides the greater chances of pollination. It is economical, need not to produce large number of pollen since the stigma and anther are very close to each other, so large number of pollen grains are not needed. There is no necessity of the bright colors of the flowers to attract the insects, etc. It preserves the desired parental characters. So parental characters are carried from the one generation to the next generation. So there is slight change in the parental character from one generation to the next generation. Very rarely these characters get changed. And lastly, there is no need of the pollen agents, as we discussed in the third step. There is no need of bright colors to attract the insects. So neither air nor insects, no agents are required. Now, but besides these merits, there are demerits or disadvantages of the pollinations are there. In self-pollination, they do not produce new varieties of plants. So since the characters do not change from one generation to another generation, so new varieties of plants are not produced at all. Second, there is a loss of vigor from one generation to the next generation. That is the ability to survive in nature. It's called the vigor. To germinate, to produce the new plants, that is the vigor. So that vigor is lost from generation to generation due to the self-pollination. It also does not remove the defective characters from one generation to the next generation. Now, advantage thus cross-pollination, it ensures the new genetic recombination. So new kind of the plants with some changed characters may be produced, and it produces new improved varieties, increased adaptability in the offsprings. So new plants are able to adapt themselves in the changed environment. Offsprings give the high yield, that is the production is more in these plants. They are resistant to the diseases, but there are certain disadvantages in the cross-pollination also. It depends on the various external agencies, air, water, insects, other animals, etc. There is need of the large number of the pollen grains, because during the transportation, many pollen grains are lost during the transportation. So there are the large number of the pollen grains are produced. It is uneconomical, and when the large number of pollens are produced, there is a loss of energy of the plant is there. Now, adaptations that favors the cross-pollination and prevent autogamy, and these are called the outbreeding devices. Unisexuality. If the plant is unisexual, if it produces only either male or female flower, then there is a 100% cross-pollination will take place. For example, in maize and papaya. Self-sterility, that is, if the flowers, even the bisexual, the pollen grains of the same plant, same flower, will not able to germinate on the stigma of the same flower. That is known as self-sterility. Dichogamy, it is the ripening of the stigma and stamen at the different times. This is of two types: protandry, where the endosium ripens first and gynoecium ripens last. In the protogyny, when the gynoecium ripens first, endosium ripens later. So protandry is seen in the cotton, lady's finger, while the protogyny is seen in the solanum. Hercogamy, that is a different length of stigma and stamen through they mature at the same time. If we look at the hibiscus plant or the soup flower, the stigma is above the anther. So the pollen grains of the stamen does not rise, is not able to reach to the upper part of the stigma, since the length of the stigma is higher than that of the stamen. For example, in the case of hibiscus. Heterostyly, one type of flower with a long stamen and the short style. Other types of flower with the short stamen and long style. For example, in the case of the primrose, incompatibility is similar to the self-sterility, where the pollen grains of the same flower are not able to germinate on the stigma of the same flower. So that is all for today.